Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special panel discussion on the topic of missiology, a contested discipline. My name is Steve Bevins. I'll introduce myself to you a little bit later, but I am going to be chairing this particular session, and I'd just like to read to you the proposal that we gave to the ASM leadership for this particular presentation to kind of situate you in the context of what we'll be talking about this afternoon. So this is what we wrote. The nature of the academic discipline of missiology is a contested one, especially in our own time. In an age of world Christianity and post-colonialism, the very validity of mission has been called into question. And this is evidenced by the disappearance or renaming of chairs of missiology in schools that once prided themselves in their commitment to mission. It is evidenced as well by renaming schools or departments of mission in ways that avoid the idea of mission and missiology altogether. Such contestation has raised a number of questions. Has missiology been superseded by studies in world Christianity? Should we rather speak about intercultural theology? Should missiology be focused more on evangelism than commitment to justice issues? Should it be a discipline confined to theology and history? Must it not always be a discipline that offers concrete ways of witnessing to and preaching the gospel? Must it always be a discipline that is in dialogue with social sciences, such as anthropology and sociology? Should not missiology or a mission perspective be a lens through which all theological disciplines are understood? These are the questions with which this breakout session will grapple. Now, I'm not sure at this stage whether we're going to answer all those questions, but we have 4 panelists who are going to talk about these issues in one way or another. We're going to start out hearing from Professor John R. Franke, who's an affiliate professor of theology at Fuller Theological Seminary and general coordinator for the Gospel and Our Culture Network in North America. He earned his D.Phil degree from the University of Oxford and is the author of over 100 articles, reviews, book chapters, as well as 12 books, including Missional Theology, an introduction and Liberating Scripture, about which he gave me a flyer, Liberating Scripture, an Invitation to Missional Hermeneutics. His work has been translated into 8 languages. He is the editor of 3 academic book series, including the recently launched Studies in Missional Hermeneutics, Theology, and Praxis. Secondly, we're going to hear from Professor Peter T. Lee, who is a missiologist who serves on the faculty of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's worked with Operation Mobilization since 1997, serving as a field missionary for 10 years in North Africa. He's a native of Seoul, Korea, and Peter migrated to the U.S. when he was 14. He's an ordained Presbyterian minister and a graduate of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and Fuller Theological Seminary. Thirdly, we're going to hear from Professor Kirstine Kim, who is the Paul E. Pearson Professor of World Christianity and Associate Dean for the Center of Missiological Research at Fuller Seminary. Her own research spans missiology, intercultural theology, and world Christianity. and she is informed by her experience of living in the UK, South Korea, India, and the US. She was a research coordinator for the Edinburgh 2010 project, vice moderator of the World Council of Churches Commission on World Mission and Evangelism, and a member of the Lausanne Theology Working Group. Her outputs include an introduction to missiology, called Joining in with the Spirit, and the Oxford Handbook of Mission Studies. Finally, I will be presenting as well. Again, my name is Steve Bevins. I'm a Catholic priest and emeritus professor at Catholic Theological Union. I have been a member of the American Society of Missiology since 1987 and have been to almost every one of these sessions since then. So it's my pleasure now to turn this over to Professor Franke.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure having used Steve's works in my classes. It's a pleasure to meet him for the first time. Well, it's good to be with you. I am by trade a theologian, and who has come to mission later in my career. So it's a pleasure to be able to address you on this topic. Here are my answers to the 8 questions that are posed. No, no, yes, no, no, yes, yes, yes. What's for dinner? But seriously, it's a great set of questions and obviously a huge topic of significant importance, but I'm going to have to paint with a very broad brush, understandably. I want to just share a bit of my own history before addressing the topic or topics that we've been presented with. I started as trained as systematic theologian at Oxford. Started teaching at an evangelical seminary outside of Philadelphia. One thing I did discover in Oxford was postmodern philosophy and became convinced that that was the important context in which to think about theology, which got me in a little bit of hot water with my evangelical colleagues, to say the least. But interestingly, and I often share this, postmodernity led me to mission. Postmodernity, with its emphasis on plurality, non-foundationalism, the importance of diverse perspectives, led my theologizing into the area of mission. And that corresponded, after about 5 years, with the book that came out that probably we're all familiar with, Missional Church, edited by Darrell Guder and a group of other important missiologists. And I became convinced of the importance of centering mission at the heart of all of the theological disciplines. So systematic theology needed to be shaped by mission, hermeneutics and biblical studies shaped by mission, thinking about how mission informs all of those disciplines. And I thought, being an evangelical, that made a lot of sense and everyone would welcome that. And when I found that wasn't the case, I remember giving some lectures at a school, I won't say which one, but a prominent school committed to worldwide mission, and talked about missional theology and the way mission-centered theology reshaped systematic theology. And the systematician at that school who was responding to my lecture said something like, this is the most dangerous stuff I've heard in 20 years of teaching. And I was a little bit surprised by that. Afterwards, I tell this story in missional theology in the introduction. One of the students came and thanked me for my lectures. He said, I'm studying to go to the mission field. This is what we put up with in mission studies all the time here. And I said, yeah, some days I wish I was just a missiologist and then the things I'm saying wouldn't be so controversial. And then he dropped the line that I've never forgotten. He said, yeah, and then you could come sit in the corner with all the rest of us missiologists that nobody cares about because we're just going far away. What you're trying to do is push mission concerns into theology, hermeneutics, and everything else. And so I became convinced of that and started thinking of, rather than theology of mission or a mission component in my theology classes, talking about missional theology, and started writing in this context, bringing mission into systematic theology. I also became convinced with the postmodern framing that this was in a lecture I gave in Canada with a respondent from the Congo who listened to me talk about postmodernity and said, John, it's important, right? But I need to correct you on one thing. In the majority world, postmodernity is called postcolonialism. It's the same driver, it's the same questions driving the conversation, but it takes on a different cast in that framing. And I became convinced of that as well. And so postmodern, postcolonial concerns begin to shape my thinking about theology. And of course, one thing I learned that should make us feel more comfortable about talking about the way the discipline of mission is contested is, don't worry, everything is contested. Everything. Theology, biblical studies, hermeneutics, mission, it's all contested, and that's okay. That's normal. I wrote a volume called Manifold Witness, The Plurality of Truth, trying to argue from a committed Christian and even evangelical perspective that plurality is not a problem. It's not a problem to be overcome. Instead, it is the very blessing of God. Those concerns, and this wraps up my kind of historical overview, led me to believe that ultimately this work, as important as it is to consider in the academy, had to be done in the local church. If folks in the local church don't think about these things and practice them and live them out, then all of our talking in the academy, well, it's fun and interesting, it may not get us very far. And so after 18 years teaching at a seminary, I made the decision to move and take up positions as theologian in residence at a couple of different local churches to try to talk about these kinds of issues and say that we need churches that become missional churches and to think seriously about what that means, especially in the context of so many of our churches, whether they label themselves as such, I came to believe are very much shaped by Christendom. They're Christendom churches. And that means in many ways, and I wish we had more time to explore this, they practice a kind of colonizing witness. The very things that many of our churches do and say and practice are shaped by colonizing assumptions. And so I made that move to the local church, and for the last 15 or so years, I've been trying to practice this work in those contexts, and doing it there has informed some of my thinking. So let me just close or mention in closing, I suppose it is the close, 3 comments about the future of missiology. The first is its location. I'm convinced that the location for missiology needs to be the local church. That is, we who serve in the academy and teaching positions need to find ways to train folks who are going to be future leaders in those churches to think missiologically about all that they're doing. I personally believe from this postmodern, post-colonial context, but I realize that is, of course, contested, so we need to think about that. But then we also need to help people in our churches understand, if you're a baptized disciple of Jesus Christ, you're called to be a missionary. You may not like that terminology, and I understand that, and we can talk about that, but that's our goal. So, when I was a minister in Indianapolis in Washington Township, we had over 40 different languages and dialects spoken within 15 miles of the church. So cross-cultural thinking ought to have shaped how we pursued witness in that context. And so many of our contexts, especially urban, need this kind of training, but folks don't have it. But even more than that, it's amazing how many folks in our church don't think that they are really participants in this grand mission of God. That's what we have pastors for, and maybe deacons and elders. But, that's their job. And so I was on an organization that started in Indianapolis called Circle City Fellows. You can check out that website if you're interested. But one of the things we talk about there is how few people in churches, in surveys and polling, believe they have any role in the mission of God. That's for the professionals. We have ordination services and consecration services for our ministers and priests and pastors and leaders. We never do that, or rarely do that, for folks who are out in the world doing work. The picture that people have is, what I do isn't really important for this church thing. That happens on Sunday morning and certain special events. But it's amazing how few people understood that in the places that they work, they are participants in this mission of God. So we started a 9-month program training folks to integrate their vocational lives with what, for lack of a better word, missional Christianity. We put booklets together and had them do readings. We made them pay a little bit because you got to have some skin in the game sometimes. But I've heard this when I've talked about these things in Indianapolis and other places here. People, boy, that would be great to do something like that in the church. Yeah, I think that's right. We need to find ways to help folks understand everybody in the congregation. We all, I think, often say that ministers, the whole congregation. But do we really believe that? And are we really practicing and teaching in ways that lead to that kind of conclusion and give people the training, the equipping to live that out in their everyday lives? So that's the first thing, location in the local church, the local community. How do we do that? And I think that is a topic that could occupy us in conferences like this in our schools for a long time. How do we do that? How do we help people to embrace that idea and be equipped for it? And I'm sure there are places where it is being done well, but in my experience in a mainline Presbyterian denomination, it's not very common. In fact, it's darn right rare. Second, the means or the end of this. What's the ultimate content of mission? What is the end? What is the mission of God all about? And of course, it's contested. But let me suggest this, following passages of Scripture like Isaiah 65 or Luke 4. This is the way I've come to think about this in my own work. That is, the end of the mission of God is the establishment of a world where everyone has enough and no one needs to be afraid. Everyone has enough, no one needs to be afraid. How do we work to that end? And I think to myself, if all of the churches around the world committed themselves to that kind of a project, we'd be living in a very different world. So I've mentioned Circle City Fellows. When I came up here, I didn't think I was going to focus on this, but in that 9-month program, the culmination of that, where they're integrating their vocation and their faith for the sake of the city of Indianapolis, their culminating project, they have to do something in the city of Indianapolis that forwards the idea of a world where everyone has enough and no one needs to be afraid. And it's amazing the things that folks come up with. Finally, let me mention the means. As we're all doubtless aware, the term mission has a lot of bad press these days, and rightfully so. Not saying there aren't a lot of good things that have happened, but mission has come to be seen by its very nature as a colonizing enterprise. One of the things that I've been involved in for the last 15 years with Michael Barham is leading a group at the Society of Biblical Literature called the Forum on Missional Hermeneutics. And we're an affiliate group. And I still remember the year that we got called on the carpet by the leaders of SBL saying, we're not going to let you continue because you're a mission organization. Use this terminology, mission, and that's inherently colonizing. And we had to rejig our proposal so that they said, okay, you're doing something different. But it was a tough slog. We have lots of people that don't come to our sessions or are critical of people who do come to our sessions because How can you participate in that colonizing enterprise known as mission? I believe that the means, from a Christian perspective, that drives the mission of God is the decolonization of Christian witness. I think we have to take a hard look at our activities and practices and ask and think about the ways that those practices may be inherently colonizing. At Fuller Seminary, we've just finished the first cohort of a D-Min group on the decolonization of Christian witness. And we've looked at the three, we could argue about this too, but three core practices of Christian witness: discipleship, evangelism, and worship, and ask in what ways have these practices been colonizing in their standard iterations in the North American environment. And having understood that, how can we work at the process of decolonization? I'm somebody who believes that the language of mission is still important. It's the theological language. Intercultural studies is methodological, right? I think the idea is good, but it's still a methodological framing rather than a theological framing. But if we're going to maintain this commitment to mission, which I personally am committed to, I think we need to think in terms of the decolonization of Christian witness. Let me conclude by mentioning, Steve mentioned it, a new series that we've just launched with Cascade. There are flyers out at the Cascade booth. It's Studies in Missional Hermeneutics, Theology, and Practice. The first volume, Liberating Scripture and Invitational Missional Hermeneutics. There are several copies available. I wrote that with Michael Barham, who's a New Testament scholar. Let me just read to you the description of the series and say that we are looking for people who want to, A, learn more about this, check out the books, but also participate in it by offering proposals and producing manuscripts. The volumes in this series explore the significance of the so-called missional term for Christian hermeneutics, theological reflection, and praxis. This entails both a critical reconstruction of mission in more holistic and decolonizing terms, as well as the ways in which this renewed conception of mission reorients biblical interpretation, theological reflection, and Christian praxis. In so doing, the series seeks to explore and reimagine texts and themes, hermeneutical dynamics, theological issues, and faithful located engagement for a post-Christendom church in the contemporary world. May God guide us as we seek to be faithful to God's mission in the world. Thank you.
I'm now going to turn this over to Peter, and Peter is going to talk about how being a missiologist is a contested profession. So, welcome, Peter.
Good afternoon. As the title of this panel suggests, missiology has long been contested, and there are many questions being raised about the discipline of missiology at this moment in time, both from within and without. There's also a growing sense that missiology in the U.S. and in North America is declining along with its institutional homes in Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries. If missiology is contested as an academic field, surely the vocation of the missiologist would also be contested. The questions facing missiology are inevitably the questions faced by missiologists regarding their vocational and professional identity and career. In my view, missiology exists so long as the people who actually do the work of missiology, missiologists, continue to exist. Therefore, it would be worthwhile to focus our attention on these people called missiologists, the ones who do the work of missiology. In this short presentation, I'm given 15 minutes, maybe I have 10 more to go. I'll try to do this in 10, maybe 12 minutes. I asked this question, in what ways is the vocation of the missiologist contested today? To answer this question, I recently had personal conversations, interviews with 6 prominent missiologists on this question of whether and in what ways the vocation of missiologist is contested. I asked them what the challenges missiologists are facing today and what might be the hopes for missiologists in the future. The interviews were short, relatively short, about 30 to 40 minutes each. And the names of these missiologists whom I interviewed are Tienu, Harold Netland, Steve Bevins, John Franke, Bob Priest, and Daryl Whiteman. And these are all distinguished, award-winning missiologists and also past and present members and or officers of ASM. I think 4 of them will be here or are already here in this conference. So I met 2 of them in person, and I had Zoom meetings with the rest of them during the month of April and May of this year. As you might have noticed, this is not a highly diverse group in terms of gender, age, and race and ethnicity. These are mostly older gentlemen, and 5 of the 6 persons interviewed are white. And this is also a group of very experienced missiologists, and that's mainly what I look for, experience in working as missiologists. From these conversations, I could draw the following 4 insights regarding the contested nature of the vocation of missiologists. The first insight is this: missiologists occupy an ambiguous and marginalized position in academia. In general, missiologists struggle to find a stable academic home and are often misunderstood or not as valued within both the academy and the church. One missiologist mentioned, when you put the word missiologist to a person, you're actually marginalizing them in the academy. And this person continued on, I would describe myself as a theologian whose work is informed by the social location of the church. If that is missiology, then so be it. And I think of myself as a misunderstood citizen in the academy. That's what one of those 6 missiologists mentioned. I won't mention who said which one. You probably can guess. Another person said, some people who teach missiology don't like to be called missiologists. That in itself suggests it's contested. And another one said, I've had to fight for missiology's place in both the academy and the church. It's often misunderstood from both ends. The second insight that I gained from these missiologists is this: missiologists have a highly interdisciplinary and thus conflicted vocational identity. The missiologist is often seen as too practical for the academy and too academic for the church. This can create identity conflict and professional vulnerability for missiologists. One person said, I don't fit cleanly into one discipline, and I don't want to. Missiology resists every categorization. That's part of its gift. Another missiologist said, I call myself an anthropological missiologist. You can probably guess who that person is. That's not a compromise, he said. It's a vocation. The missiologist's work inherently blends multiple disciplines, especially theology, anthropology, history, and sociology, which can lead to identity tension, but also to unique vocational strength. Third insight I gained from these interviews is this: missiologists, am I on 4 already? I skipped one. Which one did I skip? Oh, 3 I skipped. Okay, good. Thank you. Oh, it's tricky. So missiologists are deeply committed to the gospel witness, intercultural engagement, and the life of the global church. The missiologists have a cross-cultural, intercultural, transnational nature. one person mentioned, it's hard for me to call someone a missiologist who has never lived in another culture. This person said, a missiologist has a vested interest in the whole enterprise of Christian mission, even while being critical. And another person said, all theology is contextual. Missiology helps theology stay honest by grounding it in real life. And another missiologist said, they push the church, missiologists push the church and the academy to listen to global voices. So according to them, missiologists are not just academics. Their vocation is rooted in gospel commitment and global missions. And lastly, missiologists play a prophetic and bridge-building role within the church. The missiologist often plays a prophetic role, challenging theological, cultural, and institutional norms, while building bridges between the academy, the church, and diverse people from diverse cultures. So one person said, missiologists are disruptive, and that's a good thing. Another one said, I love being called a missiologist. It means I'm part of a vocation that connects theology and practice, local church and global church. Another person said, the missiologist can be a conscience and a burr in the saddle. Now, missiology is prophetic. It raises uncomfortable questions about power, privilege, and gospel clarity. And a good missiologist holds theory and praxis, theology and anthropology, ethics and mission in tension. You can't do missiology well without also doing self-critical reflection on power, race, and culture. These are all the sayings of these 6 missiologists, and I will continue with a few more. Another person said, the missiologist is a bridge builder between cultures, between theology and life. So according to them, the missiologist functions as both a critic and a connector, disrupting when necessary, yet always working to build understanding and faithful engagement with the world. Then what might be the future outlook and perhaps vocational hope for missiologists? Some of my interviewees expressed joy and hope in the vocation of missiologists, highlighting the relational and global and intercultural dimensions. One person said, being a missiologist is a disadvantage unless you're allowed to chart your own course. That's almost what every missiologist has to do today, charting our own course. Another person said, too many people see missiology as optional, but in a global world, it's essential. This is a vocation of joy. We help the global make sense in new cultural settings. Others noted diminishing institutional support and the need for structural changes in our institutions. But they seemed confident that there would be a resilient future for missiologists in teaching, writing, researching, and mentoring for the church. In closing, I would like to reiterate what my interviewers, my friend missiologists, emphasized, that the vocation of missiologists may be contested, but it remains necessary and vital for the church to carry out its mission. Despite diminishing institutional support and even the disappearance of institutional homes, missiologists must find ways to not only survive but thrive and remain a prophetic voice for the sake of the gospel and the church. And I thought it would be fitting to close this presentation with a quote from Andrew Walls, who wrote back in 2017, "Is there any more exciting vocation at the present time than missiology? I, who am nearing the end of my course, must envy those of you with many years to serve. May God speed you." Amen.
Thank you very much, Peter. And now we turn things over to Kirstine Kim, who will talk to us about the recent Lausanne conference.
When I have some new slides. Thanks. Thanks. I brought the bag of the conference. I left it down there, but just to prove that I had been at Lausanne 2024, I am sporting it here. My idea is to talk about the missiology of the Lausanne movement, which, like any movement, is also contested. I did so because I've now attended 3 out of the 4 Lausanne congresses in its half-century history. And each of those produced a substantial statement, as you're probably aware. 1974, the Lausanne Covenant; 1989, the Manila Manifesto; 2010, the Cape Town Commitment; and 2024, the Seoul Statement. Just to be clear, I'm not old enough to have been there at the first Congress in Switzerland in 1974. But in 1989, I accompanied my husband, Dr. Sebastian Changwan Kim, as an interpreter for the South Korean delegation to Manila. In 2010, I attended the Cape Town Congress in South Africa as a member of the World Council of Churches delegation, although I was also a member of the Lausanne Theology Working Group at that time, but they weren't going to pay for me. Then last year, I attended the 4th Congress in Seoul, South Korea, as a member of the North American delegation. I acknowledge a great debt to the Lausanne movement because its documents have been part of my missiological formation. The movement's combination of faithfulness to the scriptures, desire to share the good news of Jesus Christ, and global vision of the church inspires me to this day. So I will comment as an insider, but also as a critic of the missiology, of some of the missiology expressed in the 4 documents. But first, I wanted to give a brief introduction to the Lausanne movement for those who are not familiar with it. Its legal name is actually the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization. And the choice of evangelization rather than mission or evangelism in the 1970s reflected a desire to complete the unfinished task, an aim that was held to be in continuity with the World Missionary Conference at Edinburgh in 1910. So overall, I would say Lausanne's missiology is focused on developing cooperative mission methods and strategies to reach the whole world before Christ's return. Under the influence of the post-World War II neo-evangelicalism, and especially the evangelist Billy Graham, evangelization in Lausanne is primarily seeing individuals born again to a living and personal faith. Graham called the first Lausanne Congress to mobilize evangelicals globally in the ideological conflict of the Cold War and in opposition to the World Council of Churches, which was perceived to be missionally inactive and theologically compromised. The Lausanne movement does not aim or claim to be ecclesially inclusive. It is exclusively evangelical. But it does intentionally bring people from every nation brings them together as long as they share its brand of Christianity. It continues to be led from a US base, but other powerful churches outside the West are also significant contributors, and people of color feature increasingly in its leadership. I note here that the extent to which the 4 documents represent global evangelicalism is debatable. The Lausanne movement is a gathering of individuals who mostly self-select. At Lausanne and Manila, attendees actually proposed revisions to the draft documents. I remember the excitement in Manila about that. However, at Cape Town and at Seoul, the theological statement was simply distributed at the Congress. Furthermore, at all three congresses that I attended, there was a mismatch between what was presented in the plenaries of the Congress and the contents of the mission statements. And this, I believe, represents a tension between Lausanne's strategy group, which raises the funds for the event and is more conservative, and its theologians. The Lausanne Covenant from 1974 remains significant, not only because it is the founding document of the movement that must be signed by all participants, but also because it continues to be used by probably most evangelical mission agencies as their statement of faith. It was drafted by the British Anglican clergyman John Stott, who is credited with introducing the language of love into the more abrasive expression of Graham. The covenant contains 15 discrete paragraphs that mostly treat evangelism and how it should be conducted. However, the document is prefaced by a theological statement that mission is part of the purpose of God, a form of Missio Dei theology, and by an affirmation of the authority of the Bible, from which key verses are quoted to justify each paragraph. The Lausanne Covenant brought together methods and positions that have characterized evangelical missions for the last half century, and I have put a list of some of them there, beginning at the top on the left, the method of targeting particular ethnic groups to maximize the numerical growth of the church, which through the 1040 window and the Joshua Project still dominates a lot of evangelical missiology. A countercultural approach towards Western secular culture, but a willingness to practice contextualization elsewhere. Assertion of the uniqueness and lordship of Christ that precludes any openness to other religions on the whole, because these tend to be regarded as counter-ideologies. A conviction of the urgency of the evangelistic task in view of the numbers of unreached and in the expectation of Christ's return. Belief that evangelism or mission is the responsibility of all Christians and the whole church, and recognition that evangelization also includes social responsibility, although the relationship between the two is variously understood. The top of the next section, the importance of evangelical cooperation and global partnership to reach the unevangelized. The need for leadership, education, and mission training globally toward that end. The need for spiritual warfare to overcome obstacles in mission. The reality of the persecution of Christians that inhibits religious freedom. And the power of the Holy Spirit to renew the churches, including in its Pentecostal and charismatic expressions, which was quite far-thinking in 1974. Moving on to Manila, 1989, the Manila Manifesto was also drafted by Stott, largely developed the themes of the first Congress under the heading Proclaiming Christ Until He Comes, and using the tripartite framework of the whole gospel, the whole church, and the whole world. In addition, I note that the whole gospel was centered clearly on Christ's substitutionary atonement for personal sin. The attention to the whole church actually gave a sense of what we now call world Christianity. The church, as the agent of mission, was promoted over parachurch agencies. There was tension between the two. The world was mainly the modern world and the issues of secularization, urbanization, and totalitarian societies. Premillennialism was heightened by the launch of the AD 2000 movement in that event, and tent-making ministries were advocated to reach closed access countries, and many missionaries from the majority world were encouraged to join that effort as well. The Cape Town Commitment was drafted by John Stott's successor, Christopher J.H. Wright. The title of it of the conference was God in Christ reconciling the world to himself. And that was reflected in the statement. Like a letter of Paul, the commitment at Cape Town was in two parts: a biblical confession of faith, followed by a call to action. Part one is a systematic presentation of a mission theology in which mission begins with a loving response to the triune God, to God's word, to the gospel, to the people of God, and to the mission of God. The integrated nature of the statement, the Cape Town commitment, means that many of the dichotomies of Lausanne's missiology are overcome. For example, the assertion that evangelism is primary over social responsibility no longer appears. Church and parachurch are largely replaced by people of God. And the description of the world is grounded in the creation itself rather than in various people groups. The document shows increased reference to the role of the Holy Spirit in mission, and it also reflects Wright's own concern for ethics and his knowledge of the Old Testament. The second part, the call for action, combined the reports of the various interest groups to address the plural and globalized world, peace building, living the love of Christ among people of other faiths, discernment in world evangelization, humility, integrity, simplicity, and partnering for unity in mission. So that's the background to the Seoul Statement. The most recent document was drafted by the Theology Working Group under the majority world leadership of Ivo Pubalan from Sri Lanka and Victor Nakar from Zimbabwe. Its formation was definitely through a collaborative process, and 4 separate Lausanne consultation reports inform it. And it is meant to be the theological counterpart to the State of the Great Commission report, which was published before the Congress. And this Great Commission report arose from a global listening project, which I listened into during COVID. Many others probably did too, that identifies developments in the world, in mission, and in different regions today. The Seoul Statement assumes the earlier Congress documents, but focuses on some gaps in the understanding of the Church that lead to false teachings and and I quote, pseudo-Christian lifestyles. Its language is more straightforwardly conservative evangelical than the Stott-Wright era. It reverts to the proof text listing characteristic of the Lausanne Covenant. And it refers to the Great Commission narrowly as Matthew 28:18-20, whereas John Stott had introduced Luke, Acts, and especially John as well, the commissions there. The statement begins with a clear account of evangelical doctrine, which is Christocentric, but now includes the created order in the understanding of redemption. The expanded section on Scripture is conservative, but not fundamentalist. It adds to the earlier documents by highlighting hermeneutics, including consideration of the context for allowing for diverse readings. The Seoul Statement introduced 2 new topics to evangelical missiological discussion: the human person and technology, that are also related to each other, of course. In the first, it upholds the creation of all human beings in the image of God and our restoration to that Christ-like ideal, which is predominantly understood morally. The most attention is given to the question of human sexuality. The statement examines biblical passages to divide human beings essentially into 2 sexes. It restricts sexual intercourse to marriage and firmly rejects same-sex relations. The connection of this section to Christian witness is not specified. The statement is silent altogether on the question of women's leadership, about which the Cape Town commitment recognized divergences within the movement. However, practically, the Congress recognized the ministries of both women and men. Regarding technology, the Lausanne movement has always been ahead of other global Christian bodies in affirming and using technology's latest forms. However, the Seoul statement is more cautious. It emphasizes discernment and stewardship rather than uncritical appropriation, especially when it comes to AI. Overall, the Seoul statement seemed to me to read more like a missional church agenda and less like a text on plans for world evangelization. In the context of world Christianity, world evangelization is seen primarily as the responsibility of the church in each place, with surprisingly little reference to the sending to the unreached. The statement stresses making disciples as the aim of mission. But this is less about converting others and more about the holiness and growth of the church community to be a witness. Nevertheless, the balance of the plenary presentations in Seoul was actually heavily toward a return to evangelism and primary, and that was the only topic of the North American meeting as well. This impression was reinforced by the Congress theme, "Let the Church declare and display Christ together," which again privileges evangelism over its social dimensions. In lieu of a conclusion, because we're going to carry on discussing, I want to say just a word about missiological disciplines. Some evangelical missiologists reduce missiology to the use of social sciences to refine methods and strategies. However, the Lausanne movement has always been informed by biblical and theological reasoning that not merely founds mission, but also critiques it by calling out methods and goals that are unethical and unchristlike. However, its documents are noticeably lacking in attention to history. This lack of a critical historical perspective reduces Lausanne's ability to name mission's complicity with colonialism, racism, and other injustices. The Seoul statement does do that, but it bypasses social justice by moving immediately to Christian responsibility for peacemaking and reconciliation. That was evident also in the presentation of Dr. Ruth Padilla-DeBorst being given 15 minutes, and then the controversy about how that was responded to. So in my view, being more informed about mission history would enable the Lausanne movement to accept changes in missiology over time, which it has difficulty in doing. And then also the study of world history, and not just eschatology, would contextualize the local churches within global affairs and superpower politics. So that's where I want to leave it, but I do recommend this book written shortly after Cape Town, which has more about the background and analysis of the movement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. When I introduced this panel and the topic that we were going to discuss, I mentioned all those 7 or 8 questions, and I have to say that I certainly don't know the answer to all of these questions, but what I'm convinced of is that theology, and particularly systematic theology, needs to be informed by what I've called a missiological imagination. That is, a way of thinking theologically that places theology at the service of the mission of the church in the world, helping the church to better embody, demonstrate, and proclaim the vision of Jesus for the reign or the kingdom of God. Now, I've tried in my career as a mission theologian to do theology out of this conviction. And this is why I was delighted to read the short but important document of our late beloved Pope Francis. There's a document published on November 1st, 2023, and it's entitled in Latin, Ad Theologiam Promovendam, which I've translated, Moving Theology Forward. I believe that in this document, Pope Francis saw the need for missiology as a vital part of the theological enterprise. And this is why knowing about it and paying attention to it is crucial in the discussion that we are having this afternoon, and which our subcommittee in the revision process of ASM in these last years, our subcommittee is calling ASM to engage in more intentionally in the future, this discussion about the nature of missiology. So in this short presentation, I can only outline what the document says. But I hope the summary will encourage you to read it and perhaps read a longer paper that I've written on this, what I think is a remarkable document written by such a remarkable Pope. If you email me at sbevans, S-B-E-V-A-N-S, at ctu.edu, I will send you both documents. It's very interesting that this document, for some reason, only appears in Latin and Italian. And you'll see why. But it's a very, very interesting document. And so I translated it from the Italian with some help by Italian friends. So Ad Theologiam Promovendam's immediate context was the approval of new statutes for the Pontifical Academy of Theology. And that's a learned society of 40 theologians appointed by the Vatican. And their task is to promote dialogue between faith and reason under the guidance of the Pope. This is a very Catholic and a very Roman group. I've always had trouble translating that Latin word promovere. Literally, it means promote. So for the example, the Vatican office, or the Vatican has an office for ecumenism, and it's called the Dicastery for the Promotion of Christian Unity. Somehow, though, I don't think this literal translation expresses in English what the Latin means. In English, promote has this connotation of advertising or making something better known. So businesses promote their products, and we scholars try to promote our latest books. In the translation of the apostolic letter that I made, I rendered it to move forward. So the first sentence in my translation reads, in order to move theology forward into the future, one cannot limit it to abstractly repeat formulae or structures of the past. So I think this idea of moving theology forward is the basic idea of the document. Francis writes that the times demand a new way of thinking about theology. As he puts it, what we are living through is not simply an epoch of change, but a change of epoch. There are, as I see it, 5 major points in Ad Theologiam Promovendam. The document's quite short by Vatican standards. It's only 10 short paragraphs compared to 200 pages of Laudato Si, for instance, Francis's encyclical on the environment. But packed in them is a radical and powerful vision of how theology needs to be done in today's world. It is a vision of theology with missiology at its heart. So first of all, it's a theology in sync with a synodal and missionary church. The first point is that theology today needs to be in sync with a synodal missionary church, rooted especially in the real issues with which the world deals today. In the last several years, Francis proposed a renewal of the church, reinstating the vision of Vatican II. He's called for the development of what he calls a synodal church, based on the conviction that baptism confers upon all Christians the wisdom of the Spirit that needs to be shared with the entire church. He speaks of synodality as a constitutive element of the church, and he is convinced that the path of synodality is what God expects of the church in the third millennium. Synodality is a missionary concept. It begins with the understanding of the equality of all Christians through baptism. It's called communion. And then it calls forth the participation of all from every sector of the church. So the moment of participation. And then having listened to all, discernment is then made as to how the church should work with God in God's mission in the world. So it ends with missionary discernment and missionary action. A theology that recognizes the synodal and missionary nature of the church is a church that, Francis puts it, goes forth and so is concerned with the real issues of the world. As Francis writes, the openness to the world, to human beings in the concreteness of their real situations, with their problems, their wounds, their challenges, their possibilities, cannot be reduced to a tactical attitude, superficially adapting contents from the past expressed in new situations, but should develop as an epistemological and methodological rethinking. And so he talks about theological reflection as contextual theology. The second point of Ad Theologiam Promovendam is that theological reflection is called to a change of paradigm. This is a quote from Francis. To a change of paradigm, to a bold cultural revolution that lets it be, in the first place, a fundamentally contextual theology capable of reading and interpreting the gospel according to the conditions in which women and men live their daily lives, in diverse geographical, social, and cultural situations, and taking as an archetype the incarnation of the eternal Logos, his entrance into culture within a particular worldview with the religious tradition of a people. As far as I know, this is the first time the term contextual theology is used in an official Roman document. As I've argued in my book, Models of Contextual Theology, the term contextual theology is a stronger one than the term that Catholic teaching has used rather regularly, that of inculturation. As the Asian Catholic bishops have suggested, in tune with the thinking of the World Council of Churches, contextual theology or contextualization moves beyond enculturation to include the realities of contemporary secularity, technology, and the struggle for human social and ecological justice. This is an important move for Catholic teaching on theology and is strongly influenced by missiology. So the third point is theology as interdisciplinary. As a consequence of the need for contextual theologizing, theology needs to be interdisciplinary. Pope Francis spoke of this interdisciplinarity in the strong sense. This means that theology cannot just be multidisciplinary, but cross-disciplinary. In other words, theologians need to engage in dialogue with the disciplines of philosophy, anthropology, psychology, the arts, social sciences, hard sciences, and so forth, in a way that affects theological thinking and content. Sounds like missiology, doesn't it? He writes, "In this way is found the difficult task for theology of being able to avail itself of new categories elaborated from other forms of knowledge in order to penetrate and communicate the truths of faith and transmit the teaching of Jesus in contemporary language with originality and critical consciousness." This, of course, is what missiology is all about. I'm sorry. Theology as communal. I'm watching my time. Theology as communal is the fourth aspect. Fourth, theology needs to be done in community. Quoting his address to the International Theological Commission in 2022, Francis wrote that ecclesial synodality, therefore, needs theologians to do theology in a synodal way, developing their capacity to listen to each other, to dialogue, to discern, and to harmonize their many varied contributions. Then he says, theological institutions should therefore be places where theologians have the experience of collegiality and theological brotherhood and sisterhood. Contextual theologians have long said that the real contextualization comes from the people, who, in the words of the late pioneer of Filipino theology, Leonardo Mercado, the people are the best theologians. Theology, wrote U.S. American theologian Peter Schneller, is too important and complex to be left to professional theologians. This means that theology is truly theology that is truly contextual must be rooted in the voices and insights of ordinary people, in dialogue with theologians who can interpret their experience in the light of theology's rich tradition of the study of culture and context. Moreover, contextual theology needs to be done in serious dialogue of theologians with one another. Theologians in individual schools of theology, theologians need constantly to be sharing and reflecting together. The age of the lone theologian at her or his desk has passed. This is probably true of the lone missiologist as well. And finally, Francis talks about theology as wisdom. Theology needs to have a wisdom dimension, as he calls it, while continuing to be rigorously critical and honest. It needs to recognize the pastoral and spiritual dimension of all theological work. I often call this the need for theology to have a cash value. We have to always ask the question, so what? This depends, Francis says, on rethinking the nature of thinking, recognizing that Christian faith can be presented in a thoughtful, responsible way, but geared to touching people's hearts as well as their minds. To accomplish this, the inductive method must be used. with theology rooted in the faith, wisdom, and questions of real people. In other words, it has to be missiological. Theology is always at the service of the people, helping them to understand more deeply the liberating and life-giving reality of our Christian faith. The more we can use their language, the images of their culture, the richness of their experience, the better theology is. Even though theology is rigorous, it can be marvelously pastoral. I believe the best theology is always pastoral, and the best pastoral practice is always grounded on good theology. I think Francis understood this very well and called theologians to such an understanding. Theology is, and as he writes, a true critical way of knowing, that it is sapiential knowing, not abstract and ideological, but spiritual, worked out on one's knees, grounded in adoration and prayer. It is a transcendent knowledge and at the same time attentive to the voice of the people. Therefore, popular theology, focused mercifully on the open wounds of humanity and all creation within the twists and turns of human history, to which it prophetically proclaims the hope of final fulfillment. Just a short word of conclusion. I hope that this quick overview of Ad Theologiam Promovendam, you can see perhaps why it's only in Latin and Italian. I hope this quick overview of Ad Theologiam Promovendam has been helpful and encouraging. It certainly has been encouraging to me. I think one of the tasks of missiology is to help theologians be at the service of the church. In some ways, if theology cannot do this, it should itself be considered a contested discipline. Thanks very much. I invite now the panelists to come up here on the stage, and we can open things up for questions that you might have. And we have, I believe, about 15 minutes or so. We maybe can go over a little bit more, but I think supper is at 5:30. Is that correct, Sean? It opens at 5:15. Okay. Okay. Whoops. So the floor is open, and Sean, if you can recognize people. And
it would seem that part of what John Frank's presentation would signify is that the future of missiology depends on whether it effectively engages postmodernity. I was wondering whether John could elaborate a little bit on what he means by postmodernity and which dimensions of postmodernity missiology should engage, and whether the other panelists could also engage with that question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's just no way to do that justice in the amount of time that we have, because postmodernity itself is an immensely contested set of ideas. But I would say the most significant elements are the ways that postmodernity is open to acknowledging the finitude of all human knowledge, the power dimensions. I often think, and I'm just going to say this and let others talk because we could spend a lot of time on this, but if you think about two main areas of postmodern hermeneutics or discourse, it's the hermeneutics of finitude and the hermeneutics of suspicion. And I would say both of those can be contextualized in Christian terms in the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of sin. So the hermeneutics of finitude, creation reminds us that we are finite. There's limits to all of our knowledge. The hermeneutics of suspicion reminds us of the doctrine of sin, that we're all inclined to bend things in ways that privilege ourselves, even when we're not being intentional about that. And so postmodern and post-colonial discourse opens us up to those realities and helps us to work at correcting them. So those would be two basic observations. We could say a lot more.
I appreciated what you said in your presentation about the other side of postmodernity being post-colonial, and that decolonizing project is also an integral part of missiology, especially coming from a world Christianity perspective. That's what people see and understand, and as our conversations even here become more diverse and include people whose origins are in the colonized world, they are raising those very important questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
In a different way, I have also been thinking we are enjoying the best of time in terms of the substance of missiology. Are we not at this point seeing, maybe when it comes to the term, the darkest hour is right before the dawn? And therefore, missiology, I mean, when we look at the history of it, is at this time really in a good place. And I'm trying to look at it from that angle, whether we like to use the term mission or not, but the substance of our engagement of this matter, I think, is at its best time. And I mean, pushing back into some of the questions on this, I just want to make that comment, and I don't know how you would would think about that.
Well, I don't know, maybe the best of times, the worst of times. We're in a bit of disarray, and yet perhaps we're at a point where I think, the fact that, I just think it's extraordinary that, what Pope Francis wrote is so, it's like, he read my dreams, It's just really quite amazing, and I think quite amazing. I don't want to promote my book, but it's so interesting how my book on ecclesiology is not only making people excited among missiologists, but really in the broader realm of systematic theology. Last week, I was Sean was at the Catholic Theological Association, and people were, they were really excited about this book on a missionary understanding of the church. So maybe we are on the cusp of something, and this is maybe why we need to really engage in this discussion, and the discussion that's going to go on tomorrow and Sunday as well. So I think this is really something important. And while we may feel we're in disarray and, at the edge of the discipline, maybe not. Maybe not. Anybody else say something? Christine?
I think in some ways, missiology in institutions has been a victim of its own success in that, the theologians are all doing missiology now. So, but then the other side of it, of course, is that also missiology is much more talked about in the churches. And if it's not being talked about in the academy, then that mismatch is really problematic. So hopefully Pope Francis's words have started moving it back into the academy, and it will be very exciting to see. But I've often noticed that the Catholic Church does something, then the Protestant churches and others respond. So we'll see.
Thank you for those presentations. I think those presentations are good at telling us what to say if we are defending missiology when it's contested. But when I imagine it being contested, it's not being contested verbally to our faces, right? Like, I think one of the panelists mentioned, like, a look from a colleague or something, right? So I think you did a good job answering what to say when it's contested, but how do we communicate that?
Must be for you, Peter.
Yeah, although the assumption of the panel is, it is a contested discipline, and the vocation of missiologists as well is contested. I think there is this sense of disarray because of the traditional homes, academic homes of missiologists are somewhat declining or disappearing. I think that gives us this kind of sense of anxiety and fear. But on the other hand, as it was already mentioned, I think missiology, when it's confined within academia, is least influential or maybe even significant. But when it goes beyond the boundaries of academia and into church pews, seats in local churches, our friends, neighbors on the streets, I think that's when missiology is more effective, more fruitful, more influential. I don't think I'm answering your question, but I'm just saying whatever's on my mind. So just using this occasion since I'm kind of, on the spot right now. So maybe somebody else can answer your question.
I could just quickly add, as a theologian who traffics with theologians often aren't the most gentle, pleasant people when you're challenging their ideas. And so when we do that, if we adopt what Steve's calling a missiological imagination, I just think it's always good to have an air of gentleness and a pastoral concern that's helping, realizing, I think we didn't get here overnight. I didn't get here overnight. It's taken me years. And sometimes I say to my students, if I'd heard the things that I'm now sharing with you when I was a student, I would have probably been freaking out. So remembering that makes, we want to be gentle, help bring people along, be pastoral, and understand that, people are on different stages. I just think that's always the pastoral element in this, whether it's in the academy or the church, is really important.
I'm going to call, we have 3 people in the queue, and after that, we're going to be done. So.
Hey guys, I'm going to ask a rather direct question because you brought up the post-colonial moment, John, which I really appreciate. I'm from California. I work and I serve a group of people who are currently being terrorized with fascistic, militarized power. I'm wondering, because I think of the imperial boomerang, I think of the colonial apparatus that is now deployed upon the people who fled their homelands to find work and opportunity, who teach me the reign of God as it emerges in my work. do you think that this provides, particularly any of you in this country, an opportunity for missiology to actually speak authoritatively?
Yes.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is a Kairos moment.
And as you say, it's a boomerang. And a lot of change in the US, according to David Hollinger, has come from people who've been elsewhere and seen what's done in a colonial system and come back and changed America. And that can happen right in front of our eyes, I think.
Yeah, and I think it takes us back into closer to the context of the Gospels when Jesus is announcing this new reign, this good news, in the midst of empiric domination. And so we can learn a lot, and we can perhaps understand certain elements of the Gospels better. And, those of us who are native to North America, seeing this situation emerging, which I think has been brewing for a long time, but it's sort of raising its head, its ugly head in ways that, are consonant with what we see in empires past.
Peter? You?
I think the post-colonial perspective provides a very helpful lens to look at our own situations and all kinds of issues that we face today. I had the opportunity to study cultural hybridity as part of my doctoral dissertation, and most of the theorists, proponents of cultural hybridity are post-colonial scholars. And as an evangelical Christian, most evangelicals try to stay away from that kind of literature, but I kind of delved into it and learned a lot of things. And what I learned the most was actually sort of refining a lens through which I can look at people, and phenomena, and situations. And it was very helpful. And perhaps what John is after when he mentioned post-colonial, decolonizing is this change of perspective, using a different lens to look at our situation. And even today, in this country, do we need to use a different lens to look at our situations? That's what I'm wondering about right now.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to ask Christine or whoever. Currently, we alternately using many words like the intercultural studies or missiology in the U.S. or the global Christianity, but generally speaking, in the UK, we use world Christian, right? So I'd like to ask you that. So how would you differentiate missiology from other nomenclature like the intercultural studies and world Christianity or global Christianity? Yeah.
That could be several lectures, but and it is one of the questions that we're raising in the strategy group on the discipline of missiology for the ASM board. I posted an article on Hoover on the app, which addresses some of those things, but there are many disciplines that have spun off missiology. In ecumenics, for example, and a lot of public theology could be seen as a development of missiology and so on, and then world Christianity, intercultural theology, and so on. They're never quite the same thing, but there are obviously clear overlaps, and in these fields can integrate with each other. But I think missiology has distinctives, and I'm honing in on the Great Commission passages, that it's about our response to those, and I don't see any of the other disciplines quite doing the same.
last one.
Very lucky to get the last question in. My name is Jackie Huang. I'm a PhD student at University of Edinburgh. And as PhD students, we usually get grilled by professors, so I'm enjoying the opportunity to pose a question to professors. So my question, I really appreciate what you guys have brought up in terms of the interdisciplinary, the blurring of boundaries, and as well as staying grounded to what is relevant to the church, to the locality of how we are thinking about missiology. So I'm going to pose a question. This is more of a conundrum that I've been dealing with. So I also serve in OMF International, which is a very old mission organization with some baggage of our own. And one of the things I get asked sometimes is, because missiology's kind of evolved and grown to be this really big interdisciplinary thing, people ask me, so everything seems to be a mission, so what is mission? And I don't know how to answer them. I want some wisdom from you.
One of the things again, not to just, but in Liberating Scripture, Invitation to Missional Hermeneutics, we have a section on that, and we propose that purpose is not a bad synonym. It's not perfect. So we'll often talk about the purposes of God, the purposiveness of God, and to ask that question, then what are God's ultimate purposes in creation and in the world? And so what I've found for some folks, and again, we could nuance that and spend a lot more time, go get the book. Yeah. But I think that I find that has been helpful for folks to understand what we're after.
You have the best answer on this. You mentioned it at lunchtime.
What did I say?
Your response to Stephen Neal. Your response to Stephen Neal.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, Stephen Neal is famous for saying, "Well, if everything is mission, nothing is mission." I don't agree with that. I think if everything is mission, everything is mission. And that's, now that doesn't answer your question, but that's it's like postmodernity. It's a long story. Maybe we can talk later about that.
Just quickly, I have been teaching pastors in Korea, and I've been surprised to find out that the way they use the word mission in Korean is very narrow. So when I bring in this other meaning, missio, sending, the meaning of sending, it confuses them a great deal. So I've been kind of dealing with that, telling them, in English, we use this one word, mission, to denote, maybe missions, mission work, as well as purpose, and that kind of thing. But in Korean, we almost have to use different word, not 선교, which is mission, often translating mission, but different word for it. So there's some language issue related to mission, which we can probably take into dinner with us. Yeah.
On dinner, Peter and I were going to sit together for dinner, and so if you want to continue the conversation, you're very welcome to join us.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists, John and Peter and Christine. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There is a long conversation that will be going on for, I guess it's hour and a half in the morning tomorrow, hour and a half in the afternoon, and then an hour and a half on Sunday morning. I believe that's the way it's set up. So if you're interested, attend that session as well, and we'll continue our conversation on this whole question, which I think is extremely important for us and for this society, and I think for the church. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.